Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Ever feel like you're just on this treadmill? Just striving for perfection but never quite getting there. Like, no matter what you do or achieve, you're just not enough.
It's a common feeling, definitely.
Well, today we're diving deep into a book that really tackles this. How to Be Enough by Hendriksen.
It's a great book. It's a really cool mix of psychology and self-help. And, I really connected with it because it's not just theory. It gives you real strategies to use for understanding, and overcoming those kind of feelings of inadequacy.
Yeah, and for me, honestly, like within the first few pages, I was already highlighting so many things. But before we get too far, you can find a link to How to Be Enough on Amazon down in the description if you want to check it out.
Yeah, definitely check it out.
Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on these aha moments.
For sure.
One of the things that really struck me early on was how the book contrasts these two really iconic figures, Walt Disney and Fred Rogers,
Oh, interesting.
to illustrate the two sides of perfectionism.
Okay, yeah.
Because they were both, in their own ways, perfectionists,
Right.
but how it played out in their lives was so different.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that they were both driven by an incredible attention to detail, a real pursuit of excellence, but the way their perfectionism kind of impacted their lives and their relationships was so different.
Yeah, so we've got Disney, right, created this world of magic and dreams.
Right.
And then you've got Mr. Rogers, beloved host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Both perfectionists, but such different outcomes. What's the big takeaway there?
Well, the book goes into these biographical details, and there are all these first-hand accounts that paint this picture of how it showed up. So with Disney, even with all the outward success, he was often described as being rigid and controlling and, emotionally isolated.
Really?
There's this one story about a reporter from the New York Times who visited Disney's studio, and they picked up on this, sadness around him.
Wow.
And it seemed like he really craved connection, but his demanding nature and just this constant need for control ended up pushing people away.
That is so sad, especially when you think about, the joyful world he created for so many children.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what's the cost, right, of that kind of perfectionism, not just for yourself, but also for the people around you. What about Rogers? How did his perfectionism play out?
So Rogers, he was also really detail-oriented, meticulous, but he was known for his warmth and his empathy, a genuine connection with others. His colleagues actually described him as someone who, knew exactly what he wanted, but he achieved it by collaborating and respecting people,
Okay.
not by controlling or intimidating them. So it's like his perfectionism kind of fueled his mission to spread kindness and compassion,
That's beautiful.
rather than tearing him down or isolating him.
So it's not just about having these high standards.
Right.
It's how those standards, drive you, how they affect your relationships, and ultimately how they shape your whole life.
Exactly.
And as we were talking about this, I was thinking about, all the different ways perfectionism shows up in our own lives.
Absolutely.
It can look so different for everyone.
And that's where the book's breakdown of these three main types of perfectionism is so helpful.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
Because it's like this light bulb moment where it helps you understand not just perfectionism as this big idea, but how it actually shows up in your own thoughts and your feelings and your actions.
Okay, yeah. Walk me through those three types. I'm really curious to see which one I am.
All right. So imagine you're at a dinner party, okay, and you've spent hours preparing this amazing meal, agonizing over every little detail.
Okay.
So the self-oriented perfectionist is sitting there at the table, just internally critiquing everything they say and do, terrified of saying the wrong thing, spilling their drink.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
Their focus is inward on all their own flaws and shortcomings.
Oh, I feel seen. It's like that constant self-scrutiny, am I good enough?
Exactly. Now, across the table, you've got the oriented perfectionist. They might seem totally composed on the outside, but inside, they're silently judging everyone else's manners, what they're wearing, their conversation skills,
Oh, no.
holding everyone else to the same, impossible standards they hold themselves to,
Uh-huh.
which, of course, leads to, strained relationships and feeling isolated.
It's like that inner critic, but it's directed outward.
Precisely. And then you have the socially prescribed perfectionist. This is the person who's convinced that everyone is judging them constantly, even if there's no proof.
Okay.
They're always trying to meet these imaginary expectations, even if it means ignoring their own needs and wants.
Oof. I relate to that one, too. It's like this pressure to perform, to be the perfect parent, the perfect partner, the perfect employee, all of it.
It is exhausting.
It really
And,
is.
it's important to remember, these are just broad categories. Most people are actually a mix of all these types.
Right.
But even just knowing about these distinctions can be really helpful. You can start to see your own patterns and maybe find some ways to deal with those perfectionist tendencies that are a little bit kinder and more effective.
Yeah, I'm already thinking about how I react in certain situations. Like when I feel that wave of self-criticism or that pressure to meet everyone else's expectations.
Right.
It's like these categories give me a whole new way to look at my own behavior.
That's great. And that's one of the most valuable things about this book. It gives you this framework to not just think about perfectionism in general, but how it shows up specifically in your own life. And once you understand that, then you can start to manage it better.
I like that.
Yeah.
So it's not just about identifying the problem, but really getting to the root of it, right?
Exactly. So we've been talking about these different types of perfectionism, but the book goes even deeper than that, and explores where those tendencies actually come from.
I love that about this book. It's not just like, okay, you have this problem, but it really tries to understand where it's coming from. So what does it say about where perfectionism comes from?
Well, it actually goes beyond just like individual psychology and looks at things like family dynamics and genetics and even cultural
It's
influences.
like a nature versus nurture debate, but for perfectionism.
Yeah, exactly. And one example that really stuck with me is how kids who grew up with what's called conditional approval are more likely to develop perfectionist tendencies.
Conditional approval.
Yeah, so it's like when a child's love and acceptance is tied to their achievements or specific traits, like they have to earn it.
Oh, wow. So those kids learn that they're only worthy if they meet certain expectations, and that can totally carry over into adulthood.
Exactly. It becomes the survival mechanism to get love and validation, but it can also create this really deep fear of failure and rejection. And that can really fuel perfectionism later in life.
That makes so much sense. It's like we internalize those early messages about our worth, and they become these like subconscious scripts that we carry with us. And, speaking of internal messages, the book talks about this idea of the inner critic, which seems really relevant here.
The inner critic is that voice we all have in our heads that's constantly judging us and criticizing us. Those thoughts like, you're not good enough, you should be doing better, or why can't you be more like so and so?
Oh my gosh, I know that voice so well. It's like having a little negative gremlin living up there rent-free.
Right. And the book points out that the inner critic is often fueled by those perfectionistic tendencies we were talking about. It's like those early messages about conditional worth become internalized and they manifest as this voice of self-doubt and criticism.
Like a vicious cycle. Perfectionism feeds the inner critic, which then makes you feel even more like you're not enough. But the book also talks about the outer critic. What's the difference between those two?
The outer critic is basically the inner critic, but it's directed outwards. It's how those internal judgments and criticisms we have can unintentionally get directed towards other people, especially those closest to us.
So instead of beating ourselves up, we start criticizing our partners, our kids, or our colleagues, and we hold them to the same impossible standards that we hold ourselves to.
Exactly. And the book has some really great examples of this. Like there's a story about a woman named Lizette who was unhappy living with her college roommates, but she just couldn't bring herself to tell them.
Oh, I've been there. It's like you don't want to rock the boat even when you're miserable.
Well, Lizette ended up renewing the lease, even though it meant sacrificing her own happiness, all because she wanted to avoid confrontation and potential disapproval. She was so worried about being judged or rejected that she completely silenced her own needs.
It's heartbreaking to see how that fear of not being enough can lead us to betray ourselves and our own well-being.
Absolutely. And that's why the book really emphasizes how important it is to recognize both the inner critic and the outer critic so we can start to break those patterns of self-criticism and judgment. We need to stop doing it to ourselves and to other.
It's like we need to become more aware of those critical voices and then make a conscious choice to respond differently.
Exactly. And that's where the book's focus on shifting from labels to values becomes really powerful.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this concept of labels versus values.
So it's about recognizing those limiting labels that we often give ourselves, things like, I'm not creative, I'm a bad parent, I'm not good with people, and understanding how those labels can actually become self-fulfilling prophecies.
It's like we start to believe those labels and then we make choices based on them instead of what really matters to us. But what's the alternative?
The book encourages us to shift our focus away from those limiting labels and towards our guiding values, things like connection, kindness, growth, authenticity. It's about figuring out what's truly important to us and letting those values guide our choices and our actions.
So instead of trying to be good based on some external definition, we focus on living in a way that aligns with what truly matters to us.
Exactly. It's about moving away from needing external validation and towards a more internal approach where we're guided by our own inner compass, not by other people's expectations.
That sounds so empowering. But how do we actually figure out what our values are? It's not like they're just written down somewhere.
Well, the book has some helpful questions for us to think about, like what were those times in your life when you felt the most engaged, the most purposeful, the most connected? What were you doing? Who were you with? And then on the other side, think about those times when you felt empty, meaningless, or like you were on the wrong path. What was missing in those moments?
It's like taking an inventory of our values, taking stock of what really matters to us, and using that information to make choices about how we want to live.
Exactly. And the book also says that our values can change over time. Life experiences, relationships, even global events can change what we find meaningful and important. The key is to stay connected to our values, to revisit them every now and then, and make sure that our actions are still lining up with what we believe in.
So it's not about setting our values in stone. It's more like having an ongoing conversation with ourselves about what truly matters and making adjustments as we go along.
Exactly. It's about living with intention, making choices that are aligned with our values, and course correcting when we find ourselves drifting off track.
That makes so much sense. It's like our values become our compass, guiding us towards a more authentic and fulfilling life. And speaking of navigating life's challenges, the book also explores this idea of demand sensitivity, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Can you remind us what that is and how it shows up in our lives?
Sure. So demand sensitivity is that tendency to interpret neutral comments or even just neutral situations as demands. And that can lead to feeling obligated and resentful.
It's like constantly feeling pulled in different directions and like you can never quite measure up to everyone's expectations. But how does focusing on our values help us with this?
Well, when we're really clear about our values, it's like we create this internal filter for all those external demands. So instead of feeling like we have to say yes to every request or meet every expectation, we can pause and ask ourselves, does this actually align with what's truly important to me?
So our values become this decision-making tool, helping us decide which demands are worth our time and energy and which ones we can say no to.
Exactly. It's about setting boundaries and prioritizing what truly matters to us instead of being driven by that feeling of obligation or fear of disapproval.
It's about taking back our power and making conscious choices instead of just reacting to external pressure.
Absolutely. And the book shows how this can be incredibly freeing. You can reclaim your time and energy and focus on the things and the relationships that truly bring your purpose and joy.
It's about moving away from that reactive people-pleasing mode and into a more proactive, values-driven approach where we're in control of our own lives. And speaking of being in control, the book also talks about this thing called demand resistance, which seems like the flip side of demand sensitivity.
Demand resistance is basically that rebellious feeling of opposition to any perceived pressure or demand, even if that demand actually aligns with our own values or desires.
It's like digging in our heels even when we know logically that the request is reasonable or even something that would be good for us.
Exactly. And the book explains how this resistance often comes from a fear of feeling controlled or overwhelmed. It's like a way of protecting ourselves and asserting our independence.
So how do we deal with this? It seems tricky because we don't want to be controlled by other people's demands, but we also don't want to resist everything just to be defiant.
The book suggests that we first need to recognize those moments when demand resistance is happening, to notice that feeling of defiance or aversion when we feel pressured. Then it says we can try to reframe those demands in terms of our values to find the want to inside the have to.
So for example, instead of feeling obligated to wash the dishes because that's what good people do, we might choose to do it because we value contributing to a harmonious household.
Exactly. It's about finding that internal motivation within those external demands, connecting those actions back to what truly matters to us.
It's about reclaiming our agency and making conscious choices instead of just reacting to external pressures. The book gives this really interesting example of a woman named Jeannie who really struggled with demand resistance when it came to physical affection with her partner.
Oh yeah, Jeannie, her automatic response to any request for physical touch, even from her loving partner, was to pull away. She felt smothered and controlled, even though deep down she really valued closeness and intimacy.
It's like that feeling of being trapped or suffocated, even when the intention is loving and caring.
Exactly. And the book helped Jeannie to reframe those requests for physical touch in terms of her values. Instead of seeing them as demands, she started to see them as invitations to connect, to experience intimacy, and to express her love in a physical way.
So it's about shifting our perspective, finding the want to within the have to, and recognizing that even those requests that trigger our resistance can actually be opportunities for connection and fulfillment.
Absolutely. And it shows how when we're able to connect those actions to our values, it can transform those moments of obligation into opportunities for genuine connection and fulfillment.
It's about aligning our actions with our hearts instead of just reacting to those external pressures. And, speaking of hearts, the book also delves into the emotional side of perfectionism, particularly how we often try to control or suppress our emotions. It talks about this idea of emotional perfectionism.
Emotional perfectionism is basically the tendency to judge and control our emotions, to only allow ourselves to feel what we consider acceptable or appropriate.
It's like we're trying to curate our emotional experience, only allowing the positive emotions to surface and pushing down or denying the ones that we think are negative or uncomfortable.
Precisely. And the book explains how this might seem helpful in the short term, but it can actually be really damaging to our well-being in the long run. When we suppress our emotions, we're essentially disconnecting from ourselves, denying our full human experience.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You might be able to keep it down there for a little while, but eventually it's going to pop back up and often with even more force.
That's a great analogy. And that's exactly what happens with our emotions when we try to control or deny them. They don't just go away. They often resurface in unhealthy ways, like through anxiety, depression, or even physical problems.
So instead of trying to fight against those feelings, we need to learn to embrace them, to acknowledge that they're there and allow them to move through us.
Exactly. It's about making space for all of our emotions, the good, the bad, and the ugly, recognizing that even those uncomfortable emotions have a purpose and a message to share.
This makes me think about how the book compares our emotions to waves in the ocean.
Ah, yes, the surfing metaphor. The book explains that we can't control the waves, but we can learn to surf them. We can learn to ride them out to navigate their ups and downs without getting swept away.
It's a beautiful image, and it reminds us that our emotions, just like those ocean waves, are a natural part of life. We can't always control them, but we can learn to handle them with more skill and grace. And, speaking of navigating challenges, the book also dives into the fear that often comes with perfectionism. The fear of being judged or rejected if we show our true selves, flaws and all.
Yeah, it's that fear of not being good enough, of being found out or exposed as an imposter. And it often makes us hide our true selves behind this carefully constructed facade of perfection.
It's like we feel like we constantly need to perform to present this polished and flawless image to the world, even if it means sacrificing our authenticity and our genuine connection with others. But the book encourages us to challenge that fear, right?
Absolutely. It highlights this really interesting paradox of perfectionism. It says that in our attempts to be loved and accepted, we often end up pushing people away because we're hiding who we really are.
It's like we're so afraid of being rejected that we create the very conditions that lead to isolation and disconnection.
Exactly. And the book encourages us to embrace our imperfections and to show up as our true selves, even if it means risking some disapproval along the way.
It's about recognizing that true connection requires authenticity, the willingness to let people see us flaws at all.
Exactly. And it highlights how when we're able to embrace our imperfections and show up as our true selves, it often inspires others to do the same.
It's like we give other people permission to be authentic, to let go of that pressure, to be perfect, and to connect on a deeper, more meaningful level.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that perfectionism, with its emphasis on hiding our flaws and presenting a perfect image, actually prevents us from having the very connection we crave.
It's like that need to be perfect actually isolates us, preventing us from experiencing the joy and fulfillment of genuine connection.
Exactly. And that's why the book encourages us to embrace our imperfections, to show up as our true selves, and to trust that there are people out there who will love and accept us, flaws and all.
It's a beautiful message of hope and possibility. And one of the things that really resonated with me in this section was the book's emphasis on the importance of cultivating deeper, more meaningful relationships, both with ourselves and with others. It highlights how connection is an antidote to perfectionism.
Absolutely. When we feel connected both to ourselves and to other people, it lessens that need to strive for perfection, to prove ourselves worthy. It allows us to relax into who we are, flaws and all.
It's like that feeling of belonging, of being seen and accepted for who we truly are. And when we have that sense of connection, it frees us from that constant need to perform to seek external validation.
Exactly. And the book gives us some really practical strategies for building deeper connection in our lives.
I'd love to hear about those. What are some of those strategies?
One of the key strategies is self-disclosure, being willing to share our authentic selves with others, including our vulnerabilities, our struggles, and even those less than perfect moments.
It's about letting go of that carefully crafted image of perfection and allowing ourselves to be seen, flaws and all that. But I imagine that can be pretty scary for some people, right? It's like opening ourselves up to potential judgment or rejection.
It can be scary for sure, but the book highlights how that vulnerability is actually the key to genuine connection. When we're willing to show our true selves, it invites others to do the same, and it creates this foundation of trust and intimacy.
It's like that saying, vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. When we're willing to let our guard down to show up as our authentic selves, it creates space for others to do the same. And it's in that space of shared vulnerability that true connection can flourish.
Exactly. And the book emphasizes that self disclosure doesn't have to be some grand gesture or dramatic reveal. It can be small, everyday moments of sharing, like telling a funny story about a mistake you made, admitting to a struggle you're facing, or simply expressing an opinion that you're afraid might not be popular.
So it's about those small moments of letting people in, allowing them to see a little more of who we really are. And I think those small acts of vulnerability can be so powerful in building trust and intimacy over time. The book also talks about the importance of listening, right?
Absolutely. Listening is not just about hearing the words someone is saying, it's about paying attention to their body language, their tone of voice, and the emotions they're expressing. It's about being fully present with them, showing them that we care and that we're truly interested in what they have to say.
It's about creating that safe space for someone to be seen and heard, to feel valued and understood. And I think that's one of the most precious gifts we can give to another human being. The book also mentions this really helpful technique for having deeper conversations called listening for the doorknob.
Ah, yes. Listening for the doorknob is about paying attention to those subtle cues that someone might be inviting us into a deeper conversation. It might be a comment about a challenge they're facing, a question that seems to be looking for more than just a surface level answer, or even a change in their body language that suggests they're ready to share something more personal.
It's like those moments when someone cracks open the door a little and we have the choice to either step through or let it close again.
Exactly. And the book encourages us to step through those doors, to lean into those moments of potential connection, even if it feels a little uncomfortable or unfamiliar.
So instead of just sticking to small talk, we can take those cues and go a little deeper, ask a follow-up question, or share a relevant experience of our own. It's about being willing to be a little more vulnerable, to go beyond those safe and predictable conversational scripts.
And it's in those moments of vulnerability and shared experience that true connection can really emerge.
It's like those conversations that seem insignificant on the surface can sometimes lead to the most profound and meaningful connections if we're open to it. The book also highlights the importance of escalating disclosure, which I found really interesting. What exactly does that mean?
Escalating disclosure is about gradually sharing more personal information as a relationship develops. We wouldn't share our deepest secrets with a stranger, but as we get to know someone better, as trust and intimacy build, we might feel more comfortable sharing more of our authentic selves.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion slowly over time as the relationship grows deeper and stronger. But how do we know how much to share and when? It seems like a tricky balance to strike.
The book emphasizes that there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It depends on the relationship, the context, and our own comfort level. But it encourages us to pay attention to those cues, to listen for those doorknobs, and to trust our gut feeling.
So it's about being mindful of the other person, respecting their boundaries, and sharing at a pace that feels safe and comfortable for both people.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that we don't have to share everything to create a deep connection. It's about those moments of genuine sharing, those glimpses into our true selves that allow true intimacy to blossom.
It's like those small acts of vulnerability, those moments of shared humanity that weave the fabric of deep and meaningful connections. And it's a reminder that perfectionism, with its emphasis on hiding our flaws and presenting a flawless image, is actually preventing us from having the connection we crave.
Precisely.
Now let's talk about something that I think is a big one for a lot of people, especially with social media these days, social comparison, and how it affects our sense of self-worth.
Social comparison is that natural tendency we have to compare ourselves to others to kind of size ourselves up based on how we stack up against those around us. And the book points out how this can be especially challenging for people who struggle with perfectionism.
It's like there's this constant pressure to measure up to be as good as or even better than everyone else. And with social media where everyone's showing their highlight reels, it seems like that pressure is even more intense.
Absolutely. And the book explains that social comparison usually leads to one of two things. Either you feel inferior or superior. When we compare ourselves to people we see as better than us, it can make us feel inadequate, self-doubting, and even resentful.
It's like that feeling of not measuring up, of always falling short. And I think that can really fuel perfectionism, that constant striving to be better, to prove ourselves worthy.
And then there's the flip side where we compare ourselves to people we see as worse than us, and that can make us feel superior, smug, and even disconnected from others.
It's that feeling of being better than, of looking down on other people, and while it might give us a temporary ego boost, it ultimately isolates us and prevents us from connecting with others on a deeper level.
Exactly. And the book highlights how both of these outcomes, feeling inferior or feeling superior, are ultimately rooted in the same belief that our worth is determined by our external achievements and how we compare to others.
So it's like that need for external validation is at the heart of social comparison, constantly looking outside of ourselves for a sense of worthiness.
Precisely. And the book encourages us to challenge that belief, to recognize that our worth is inherent. It's not dependent on external measures or comparisons to others.
It's about shifting from that need for external validation to a more internal approach, where we recognize that we are worthy simply because we exist, not because of what we achieve or how we compare to others. It's a huge shift in perspective and one that can be so liberating. And you know what's interesting is that the book also points out that we often compare ourselves to others without even realizing it.
It's like those automatic thoughts that pop into our head. She's so much more successful than me. I wish I had her body. I'm so glad I'm not as messy as him. And we might not even be aware of how much those comparisons are affecting our mood and how we feel about ourselves.
And that's why the book encourages us to become more self-aware, to notice those moments when we're comparing ourselves to others, and to gently challenge those thoughts.
Exactly. Instead of letting those comparisons run wild in our minds, we can pause and ask ourselves, is this comparison actually helpful? Is it making me feel more connected and compassionate?
It's like taking back control of our thoughts and choosing to focus on what's uplifting and inspiring rather than what's bringing us down.
And it takes practice and effort, but it can lead to greater self-acceptance, peace of mind, and more genuine connection with others. This reminds me of how the book emphasizes the importance of embracing imperfection, not just in ourselves, but also in others.
It's like when we can see the humanity in other people to recognize that we're all perfectly imperfect in our own unique ways. It lessens that need to compare and compete. It allows us to connect on a deeper level, to appreciate our differences, and to celebrate our shared human experience.
Absolutely. It's about shifting from judgment to acceptance, from separation to connection. And I think that's a powerful antidote to the isolation and self-doubt that so often come with perfectionism.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, navigating the complexities of life with our own unique strengths and challenges. And when we can embrace that perspective, it creates a sense of belonging and shared humanity that is deeply healing and empowering.
I couldn't agree more. One of the things that really stood out to me in this section was the emphasis on showing our true selves, not just to other people, but also to ourselves.
It's like we often hide our true selves behind this mask of perfection, even from ourselves. We might deny our vulnerabilities, suppress our emotions, and pretend that we have it all together, even when we're struggling inside.
Yeah, it's like that fear of being judged or rejected, that need to present a perfect image. It can even affect how we see ourselves.
And the book encourages us to challenge that fear, to be more honest and compassionate with ourselves, to acknowledge all of our experiences, even the parts that we might not like.
Exactly. It's about dropping the act and allowing ourselves to be seen flaws and all even by ourselves. It's a brave act of self-love.
It is. It's like making peace with ourselves, recognizing that we are worthy of love and belonging just as we are. And I think that's such a powerful foundation for living a more fulfilling and connected life.
I completely agree. It's a journey that takes ongoing awareness, kindness, and a willingness to challenge those ingrained patterns of self-judgment and denial. But it's a journey that can lead to greater self-acceptance, emotional freedom, and a deepest sense of authenticity. Absolutely. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. It might cover it up, but it's not actually going to heal anything.
Yeah, it makes sense. And that's where the book's message of self-acceptance and embracing imperfection is so important, right? It's like recognizing that we are worthy, flaws and all, and we don't need to compensate or overachieve to earn love and belonging.
Exactly. It's about letting go of that need to constantly prove ourselves and just accepting who we are in all of our complexity. The book also talks about how societal expectations, especially in certain cultures or communities, can really contribute to this pressure to overcompensate.
It's like all those messages we get both directly and indirectly about what it means to be successful or worthy or even lovable. And when those messages are based on these unrealistic standards or impossible ideals, it can create this breeding ground for perfectionism and overcompensation. The book had that example about college prep programs that really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah, the one about how those programs, while they're incredibly valuable for supporting students from underrepresented backgrounds, they can also unintentionally reinforce this message that these students need to work twice as hard and be twice as good to achieve the same level of success as their more privileged peers.
Yeah, it's like that pressure to overcompensate to prove they're worthy can become an extra burden instead of a source of empowerment.
Exactly. And it just shows how important it is to really look at those societal messages and understand how they might be affecting our own beliefs and behaviors.
It's about developing that critical awareness, right?
hmm
To be able to question those messages and decide which ones we want to take on and which ones we want to reject.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that our worth doesn't come from those external measures of success, but from our inherent value as human beings. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another really important theme in the book, finding that balance between striving for excellence and embracing imperfection.
This seems like a tricky thing to balance, especially for people who are really driven to achieve and excel. How does the book help us find that balance?
Well, the book encourages us to shift our focus away from achieving perfect outcomes and towards embracing the process, to find joy and fulfillment in the journey itself, even when things don't go exactly as planned.
It's like that saying, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And I think that's such an important reminder, especially in a culture that often glorifies achievements and overlooks the value of the process.
Exactly. And the book points out how this shift in focus can actually make us happier and even improve our performance when we're not so fixated on the outcome, when we're able to enjoy the process. It frees us up to be more creative, more resilient, and more connected to the experience itself.
It's like getting into that flow state where you're totally immersed in the moment without that pressure of needing to achieve a specific result. The book had that great example about the young cellist named Dima that really illustrated this.
Oh, yeah, Dima. She was asked to perform with this really prestigious ensemble, and she was so anxious about the performance. She put so much pressure on herself to play perfectly and impress everyone.
Yeah, it's like that fear of failure, that need to prove herself worthy. It was taking over and preventing her from enjoying the experience.
Exactly. But then, as she was performing, she had this realization that the music itself was beautiful, regardless of whether she hit every note perfectly. She shifted her focus from her performance to the experience of creating music, of connecting with the other musicians, and of sharing that beauty with the audience.
It's like she rediscovered the joy of playing music, the passion that had drawn her to it in the first place, and that allowed her to relax and truly shine.
Exactly. And I think that's a lesson we can all apply to different areas of our lives. It's about finding that balance between striving for excellence and embracing imperfection, to enjoy the journey, not just the destination. The book also talks about the importance of enjoyment, something that can often get lost when we're chasing perfection.
That makes sense, especially for people who are really driven to achieve, to constantly improve, to check things off their to-do lists. What insights does the book offer on this?
The book encourages us to make time for enjoyment for those activities that bring us pleasure and satisfaction simply for the sake of experiencing them, not because they're productive or goal-oriented.
It's like giving ourselves permission to have fun, to do things just because they bring us joy without the pressure of needing to achieve something or prove ourselves worthy.
Exactly. And the book highlights how this can be a challenge for people with perfectionistic tendencies who often feel guilty or unworthy when they're not being productive or achieving something.
It's that ingrained belief that our worth is tied to our productivity, that we have to constantly be striving, achieving, doing to deserve love and acceptance.
And the book challenges that belief. It reminds us that we are worthy simply because we exist, not because of what we achieve. It encourages us to reclaim those moments of enjoyment, to do things that bring us pleasure and satisfaction just for the experience of it.
So it's recognizing that rest, play, and enjoyment aren't luxuries or indulgences, but essential parts of a balanced and fulfilling life.
Exactly. And it highlights how those moments of enjoyment can actually make us feel better overall and even boost our productivity in other areas of our lives. When we're feeling refreshed, recharged, and connected to our sense of joy, we're better equipped to handle challenges, to be more creative, and to connect with others in a more genuine and meaningful way.
It's about finding that balance, that rhythm that honors both our need to achieve and our need to just be to experience joy and tap into our playfulness.
Exactly. And the book encourages us to experiment with incorporating more enjoyment into our lives, to try new things, to revisit old passions, and to just make space for those activities that bring us a sense of delight and wonder.
It's about reclaiming our joy, remembering what it feels like to have fun, to be fully present in the moment, and to experience life with a sense of wonder and delight. Speaking of playfulness, the book also talks about letting go of rigidity and embracing flexibility.
Rigidity, when it comes to perfectionism, is all about those inflexible rules and expectations we put on ourselves that need to have everything just so to control every outcome and to avoid any possibility of making a mistake.
It's like being trapped in this cage that we build ourselves, constantly trying to meet these impossible standards and feeling anxious or inadequate when we inevitably fall short.
And the book points out how this rigidity can be incredibly draining and ultimately self-defeating. It prevents us from experiencing the spontaneity and joy of life, from connecting with others in a meaningful way, and from embracing the messy, unpredictable nature of being human.
It's like that rigidity creates a wall between us and the world, preventing us from fully experiencing all the richness and beauty that life has to offer. But how does the book help us break free from this cage of rigidity?
It encourages us to embrace flexibility, to loosen our grip on those rigid rules and expectations, and to allow for more spontaneity, imperfection, and even mistakes.
It's about letting go of the need to control every outcome and embracing the unknown, trusting that we can handle whatever challenges or surprises come our way.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that mistakes aren't failures, they're opportunities for learning and growth. The book talks about how people with perfectionistic tendencies often have this very specific and usually unforgiving set of rules that they live by. It calls it the inner rule book.
It's like that internal set of shoulds and musts that dictate how we think we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to achieve, and even how we're supposed to feel.
Exactly. And the book encourages us to take a look at those rules, to ask ourselves where they came from, if they're still working for us, and if they align with our values and our desire for a happier, more fulfilling life.
So it's about becoming aware of those rules, questioning whether they're actually true, and then deciding which ones we want to keep, which ones we want to get rid of, and which ones we might want to change. The book used the example of Francesca and her party planning to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah, Francesca. She struggled so much with perfectionism when it came to hosting parties. She had this rule that parties had to be perfect, that she had to impress her guests, and that everyone had to have a good time.
And that rule was creating so much stress and anxiety for her. It made her overspend, overprepare, and ultimately miss out on enjoying the party itself.
Exactly. The book encouraged her to examine that rule, to ask herself if it was realistic and if it was really serving her. And what she realized was that she valued connection, hospitality, and creating a fun and welcoming atmosphere for her guests. And she could achieve all of that without needing everything to be perfect.
So it's about moving away from that rule-driven way of thinking and towards a more values-driven approach, recognizing that we can get the results we want without needing everything to be perfect or controlled.
Precisely. And the book encourages us to experiment with new behaviors that are in line with our values, even if those behaviors go against our ingrained rules or expectations. It's about trying out new ways of being and seeing what happens.
It's like those values become our compass instead of those rigid rules we've been holding on to. And it's about having the courage to step outside our comfort zones and try new things, even if we make a few mistakes along the way.
Absolutely. And it's important to be patient with ourselves and kind to ourselves throughout this process. Change takes time, and we're not going to get it right every time.
It's about embracing the journey imperfections and trusting that we're moving in the right direction, even if it's not always a straight line. Speaking of journeys, I think that's a great metaphor for the overall message of how to be enough. It's not about reaching some fixed state of perfection, but about embracing the ongoing process of becoming our most authentic selves.
Beautifully said. It's a journey of self-discovery, of letting go of those impossible standards, of accepting our imperfections, and of finding a more compassionate and connected way of being in the world.
And I think this book is a really wonderful and practical guide for navigating that journey with more self-awareness, kindness, and grace.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into How to Be Enough by Hendriksen. We've explored so many insightful concepts and practical strategies for embracing our imperfections, cultivating self-compassion, and living a more authentic and fulfilling life. What are your final thoughts on the book?
I think this book is fantastic. It's full of wisdom, compassion, and practical advice for anyone who struggles with feeling like they're not good enough. What stood out to you the most?
I think the most powerful takeaway for me is that we are already enough just as we are. The book reminds us that perfection is an illusion and that it's our imperfections that make us unique and lovable.
I love that. It's a message of self-acceptance and freedom, and one that I think we all need to hear.
Absolutely. And I appreciate how the book doesn't just talk about these ideas, but also gives us concrete tools and strategies for putting them into practice.
It's a book that speaks to both our minds and our hearts. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into how to be enough. We've really just scratched the surface of this insightful and inspiring book, and we encourage you to check it out for yourself. You can find the link in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, your family, or anyone who you think might benefit from this message of self-acceptance.
And definitely let us know in the comments what resonated with you the most. What are you taking away from this deep dive? We love hearing from you.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive. SAMPAM.